The Articles of Confederation was the first governing document of the United States and was written in the summer of 1777 in York, Pennsylvania. In the Articles, the Confederation was capable of making war, negotiating diplomatic agreements, and resolving issues regarding the Western territories. It could also print money and borrow inside and outside of the U.S. One major weakness was it lacked taxing authority. It had to request funds from the states. A secondary weakness was for every one state there was only one vote, and it also created to make a weak national government designed to manage the American Revolutionary War. When the war ended in 1783, the weakness became obvious, and the national leaders such as George Washington and Alexander Hamilton called for a new charter.
The problems with the Articles truly came to fruit in Massachusetts in the year 1786. There, because of unfair taxes on farmers, putting many of them into debt, a man named Shays led a revolt against the system. Daniel Shays was a Revolutionary War veteran who organized farmers to shut down debtors' courts. Farmers had previously attempted to work within the framework of government, seeking only to modify it and improve it. But by the autumn of 1786, state lawmakers had issued only small or token reforms, and by then they were too late.
The convening of the Constitutional Convention took place inside of the State House in Philadelphia in the year 1787. The convention consisted of 55 delegates from the several states to frame a constitution. One reason that the convention was formed was to address the problems in the United States of America after gaining independence over Great Britain, but it was mainly to revise the Articles of Confederation.
Prominent men who came to the convention were George Mason, Edmund Randolph, Roger Sherman, Rufus King, Elbridge Gerry, William Patterson, James Wilson, Roger Morris, Gouverneur Morris of New York, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, and George Washington. These men came from Virginia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York. As befitting any great democracy promoting free thought, many men came to the convention with their own ideas on how the new government should function. One such man was James Madison, and he called his idea the Virginia Plan. In the Virginia Plan, the legislature's membership would be determined proportionately to the state's population. An executive would exist to ensure the will of the legislature, and national veto power would hold sway over any state legislation. Another collective idea was the New Jersey Plan. Under the New Jersey Plan, the current Congress was maintained but granted new powers, such as Congress being able to set taxes and force their collection, something that had been left up to the states under the Articles. An executive would be elected by Congress, and the plan allowed for a multi-personal executive. Laws set by the Congress took precedence over state law. There were other plans as well, and these would set the basis for the issues discussed during the convention, and would be mixed and matched as the debate went on. A committee of detail was formed, so as to take everything discussed and put it into a rough draft. The many ideas being debated need to be written down, so as for all to be able to vote on them for the final draft. The issue of slave status was important as well. If slaves counted as people, or part of the population, then southern states where slavery was prevalent wielded far more power than their northern counterparts. Northern states banded together on July 11, 1789 to completely remove slaves from the population count. The southern states would not have this, though. They eventually came to a compromise called the Three-Fifths Compromise. In it, 5 slaves counted as 3 people or population points. However, to keep southern states from just importing more slaves, boosting their population, the northern states pushed for the slave trade to be abolished. The southern states, in exchange for a prohibition on export taxes, agreed to allow the slave trade to continue for just 20 more years and for imported slaves to be taxable. One very controversial issue was state suffrage. The larger states, especially the southern ones, favored representation by population, therefore giving them more influence. Smaller states would lose their influence, however, even though they were economically and culturally more important. The answer to the controversial issue of state suffrage came through Roger Sherman. Roger Sherman proposed the Connecticut or Great Compromise. On June 9, 1787, he took the floor and proposed that the proportion of suffrage in the first branch should be according to the respective numbers of free inhabitants, and that in the second branch, or Senate, each state should have one vote and no more. Therefore, popular vote was realized, but the smaller states did not lose their influence. Another important issue discussed during the convention was the power of the executive. States' rightists wanted a weak executive, and nationalists a strong one. The tyranny of the kings of Britain was still fresh in the founding fathers' minds. However, James Wilson noted that each of the states had single executives, that is, governors. The idea was well known and seemed to work. Each man could relate to it. When it came to vote, the single executive prevailed.
Members of the Constitutional Convention had their own opinions on the Constitution, and so there were two major groups that were formed, Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Some of the opinions the Anti-Federalists had on the Constitution were that it gave too much power to the national government at the expense of the state governments. There were no Bill of Rights. The national government could maintain an army in peacetime, and the elective branch held too much power. But the Federalists had all the answers to the Anti-Federalists' complaints. One was that the separation of powers into three independent branches protected the rights of the people, and that each branch represents a different aspect of the people. And because all three branches are equal, no one group can assume control over another. Also, listing rights can be a dangerous thing. If the national government were to protect specific listed rights, what would stop it from violating rights other than the listed ones? Since we can't list all of the rights, the Federalists argued that it would be better not to list it at all. Some examples of people who were Federalists at the convention would be Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. Also, examples of Anti-Federalists at the convention would be Patrick Henry and George Mason. The final draft of the United States Constitution, it consisted of 7 important articles. The 7 articles were: 1. Legislative power, which describes the legislative branch of the government, U.S. Congress, which included the House of Representatives and the Senate. 2. Executive power, which describes the presidency procedures for the selection of the president, qualifications for office, the oath to be affirmed to the powers, and duties for the office. 3. Judicial powers, which describe the court system, including the Supreme Court. 4. States' powers and limits, which describe the relationship between the states and the federal government. 5. Process of amendments, which describe the process necessary to amend the Constitution. 6. Federal power, which establishes the Constitution and the laws and treaties for the United States to be made in accordance with it, to be the supreme law of the land. 7. Ratification, which sets forth the requirements for ratification of the Constitution.
The states that ratified the Constitution in chronological order were Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Connecticut, Georgia, Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, Maine, Virginia, New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island. Another such plan was the New Jersey Plan. In it, the current Congress was maintained, but it was granted new powers, one such being the setting of Stop. As befitting any great democracy, these men came from Virginia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey.